Musical historians may dispute the origins of bluegrass music, but few would argue that one of its principal architects was Bill Monroe. Contrary to popular opinion, Bill Monroe did not grow up on a hardscrabble farm in the Appalachians. During his early childhood, he lived on his family's 600-acre farm in western Kentucky's Ohio County, far removed from the Appalachian Mountains, and even to the west of the traditional bluegrass area of central Kentucky. His father, Buck Monroe, was an entrepreneurial businessman who operated the farm, timbered the forest, had his own sawmill, and even sold coal from his own mine. Bill's father was a talented dancer who enjoyed a local dance called the Kentucky Backstep. His mother, Melissa, was a singer and talented musician who played the fiddle, accordion, and harmonica. And his uncle Pen Vanderveer was an accomplished fiddler who performed locally. Bill was born into this musical family on September 13, 1911, the youngest of 8 children. Although his family had lived in western Kentucky for 4 generations, his childhood musical influences and early career still led him to a progression from traditional mountain music and Appalachian folk songs to what became known as bluegrass music. Fast tempos, complex melodies, and high-pitched vocals marked bluegrass. Monroe once described the bluegrass sound as Scottish bagpipes and old-time fiddlin'. It's Methodist and Holiness and Baptist. It's blues and jazz, and it has a high, lonesome sound. 2 of his older brothers, Birch and Charlie, played the fiddle and the guitar, so young Bill was relegated to playing the mandolin. His older brothers made him remove 4 of the 8 strings so he didn't play too loudly. Bill lost his mother when he was only 10, and his father 7 years later. Being the youngest, he was raised by his siblings, but as they moved away, he found himself in the care of various aunts and uncles, especially his Uncle Pen. Pen played the fiddle, and young Bill often accompanied him with his mandolin at Pen's performances. They were pivotal moments in his young life, and his love for his uncle was revealed in one of his most memorable songs from 1951, Uncle Pen. As Monroe biographer Richard Smith said, Vanderveer gifted the young Monroe a repertoire of tunes that sank into Bill's orally trained memory and a sense of rhythm that seeped into his bones. Also influential in Monroe's early musical life was Arnold Schultz, a black fiddler and guitar player who introduced Monroe to the blues. Schultz played fiddle in a bluesy, syncopated style, getting sound out of the instrument not commonly heard in country playing. Bill often accompanied Schultz on guitar. Although it has been suggested that Bill was a direct descendant of U.S. President James Monroe, this is not the case. Revolutionary War veteran John Monroe, the patriarch of Bill's family, received a land grant in Kentucky. He was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, the same county where President Monroe was born. Both men were born in the same decade, with John being born in 1749 and President Monroe in 1744. The elder Monroes could have been cousins, but due to their ages, Bill could not have been a direct descendant of the president, perhaps a distant cousin, but not in the direct bloodline. If you're enjoying this documentary, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel to help us produce more videos like this. While Bill was still a teenager, his brothers Birch and Charlie joined the Great Urban Migration and moved to the Chicago area to work for Standard Oil. Bill followed them in 1929. They continued to play music in their spare time and picked up occasional paying gigs until they were selected to be part-time exhibition square dancers on WLS Radio's Barn Dance Roadshow. In 1934, Bill and Charlie left Standard Oil to become a full-time country music duo. Charlie, who was 31 at the time, played guitar and sang lead, trying to get the audience to have a good time. On the other hand, Bill, who was only 23, was more reserved and focused on playing the mandolin and singing high, lonesome harmonies. The Monroe brothers began singing on the radio every day for the patent medicine company Texas Crystals in Shenandoah, Iowa, and Omaha, Nebraska. After a short time, the company sent them to the East Coast to perform on WIS in Columbia, South Carolina. However, sales for Texas Crystals didn't go well, and the brothers ended up switching to a different company, Crazy Water Crystals, which was based in Charlotte. By 1936, they were doing 2 shows a day, one in Charlotte on WBT and the other in Greenville. RCA Victor executive Eli Oberstein discovered the Monroe brothers' talent when he came to Charlotte for a week of recording in 1936. It took some convincing, but the duo finally agreed to record with RCA. Their first release from that session, the hymn "What Would You Give in Exchange for Your Soul," was a huge hit in the South. By the time of their last recording session in Charlotte in 1938, the Monroes had moved to Raleigh and were performing on WPTF. The Monroe brothers recorded a total of 60 songs as a duo, and many of them, like "Roll On Buddy," "9-Pound Hammer," "On Some Foggy Mountaintop," and "Roll in My Sweet Baby's Arms," have become classics in bluegrass and country music. When they first started recording in Charlotte, their music didn't sound like bluegrass yet, especially the slower hymns with their emotional vocals. But even on their first song from the February 1936 session, "My Long Journey Home," you can hear Bill Monroe's distinct mandolin style, for which he would later become famous. In their later recordings, the style became more pronounced. Bill Monroe attributes this to their daily performances on WBT and other Crazy Water stations. He said, "Radio was very important. You knew people were listening to you closely every day, so you worked to play it right." As time went on, Bill wasn't happy with the old-time sound of the duo. Charlie, on the other hand, didn't want to change what people were enjoying. In the summer of 1938, while in Raleigh, Bill left to start a band that would help him reach into a new, tighter sound. Charlie spent much of the rest of his career in the Carolinas, based in Greensboro, and recording for RCA at the 1938 and 1939 Rock Hill sessions. His band, the Kentucky Partners, became an important training ground for future bluegrass stars, including Lester Flatt, Curly Sackler, Dave Stringbean Aikman, Red Rector, and Ira Leuven. They also did daily radio shows on various stations, one of which was WBT Charlotte, where they joined Grady Cole for a 5:45 a.m. farm time program in early 1946. Charlie retired to Kentucky in the late 1950s, but returned to the Charlotte area for a final performance at the Lake Norman Music Hall. While Charlie was still a popular entertainer in the Southeast, Bill Monroe was working to create the new sound of bluegrass. Initially, Bill moved to Little Rock, where he formed a band named the Kentuckians, but this was short-lived. It wasn't until he moved to Atlanta that the Bluegrass Boys were formed. The first lineup of the Bluegrass Boys played in Atlanta and Asheville in 1939 and joined the Grand Ole Opry in October of 1939. Bill's first hire in August 1938 was Cleo Davis, who played guitar and mandolin. He and Bill rehearsed for several months before making their first appearance on Asheville radio station WWNC. He was with the band when they joined the Grand Ole Opry, but left shortly before they started recording. Art Wooten was the first fiddler to join the Bluegrass Boys, early in 1939. He played fiddle for the band's first Grand Ole Opry performance in October of that year. He left before the first recording session, but came back in 1941. He recorded 8 tracks with Monroe, including the popular fiddle tunes Orange Blossom Special and Back Up and Push. Tommy Millard, who Bill nicknamed Snowball, also joined the group in early 1939. He was the MC and comedian and played the spoons, bones, and jug. He left shortly after their move to Greenville, South Carolina that spring, and did not appear with the band on the Grand Ole Opry. After World War II, he left show business and entered the ministry. Bass player Amos Guerin replaced Millard in Greenville in the spring of 1939. He also played with the band during its Opry debut, but left shortly after and before the first recording session. After taking over for Art Wooten in the summer of 1940, Tommy Magnus played fiddle in the Bluegrass Boys' first recording session that October. He was featured on the fiddle tune Katy Hill. Monroe once said about him that he had a great old-time fiddle touch, rich and pure, but he could also put a little bit of blues into it. Magnus went on to form his own band, the Tennessee Buddies, which featured Don Reno and Red Smiley. Between 1938 and Bill's death in 1996, there were more than 150 regular members of the band, with dozens of others as either fill-ins or studio musicians. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys hit the Grand Ole Opry stage on November 25, 1939, where they opened with Mule Skinner Blues, an old Jimmie Rodgers tune, which would become one of their group's signature songs. They quickly became one of the hottest touring acts out of Nashville's WSM studios. They recorded their first records in Atlanta on October 7, 1940. By the end of the 1940s, the South was obsessed with the music they called bluegrass, after the name of Bill Monroe's band. They stood out from other country bands with their energetic and powerful sound that used acoustic instruments and featured high vocal harmonies. Bill's music was a mix of string band, gospel, work songs, country, and blues, and they sang in different styles including duet, trio, and quartet harmony, all driven by Bill's powerful lead singing. After trying out different instruments, Bill settled on mandolin, banjo, fiddle, guitar, and bass for the core of his band. While some bluegrass fans say the genre started in 1939, when Monroe first appeared on the Grand Ole Opry, most believe that the classic bluegrass sound came together in December 1945 when Earl Scruggs joined the band. Scruggs, a 21-year-old from North Carolina, played a unique and driving three-finger banjo style that electrified audiences. Also instrumental in the classic 1945 lineup of the Bluegrass Boys were Lester Flatt on guitar and lead vocal, Chubby Wise on the fiddle, and Howard Watts on bass. Together, this group brought a fresh and exciting sound that would come to define bluegrass music. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys were early adopters of using microphones and amplifiers. Up until that time, bluegrass groups relied solely on acoustic instruments and unamplified voices. But Monroe changed all that when he started using sound systems that would allow him to play before larger audiences in larger venues. By 1946, the Bluegrass Boys were a top country music act, with successful hits and large crowds at their tours across America. The members of the band would erect their own large circus tent in each town they played. The day's events would also feature Monroe's baseball team, playing against local teams before the concert. Throughout the late 1940s, the band continued to be popular, with 5 more top singles. Other musicians started to imitate Monroe's sound, with the Stanley Brothers being one of the most notable. In 1946, Monroe and his band started recording for Columbia Records, and on September 22nd of that year, they recorded the song that Monroe is probably most famous for, Blue Moon of Kentucky. Like most songs, there's a backstory for Blue Moon of Kentucky. When Monroe was touring in Florida, he saw a big full moon in the sky, and it reminded him of the moons he used to see back home in Kentucky. A blue moon is a phenomenon that happens when there are 2 full moons in one month. The second full moon becomes the blue moon. The idea of 2 moons rising could also apply to what happened with the song for Monroe, and for the young artist who chose to record the song as his debut. Let's jump ahead to October 1954. Backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, a very nervous young singer from Memphis was preparing for his first appearance on the Opry stage when he bumped into Bill Monroe. Elvis Presley was nervous for many reasons, but one was his concern that Mr. Monroe would disapprove of his recent release of Blue Moon of Kentucky. Presley had turned the waltz into a 2/4 time rocker and a near parody of the original. Bill had a reputation for gruffness, so Elvis was relieved when Bill greeted him warmly and said, "If it helps your career, I'm for it 100%. As an even higher compliment, Bill later went on to record Blue Moon of Kentucky in the same style as the Elvis Presley version. In 1949, Bill Monroe had a falling out with his record label, Columbia, because they had signed the Stanley Brothers. He thought the Stanley Brothers were just imitating his style. In 1950, he signed with Deca Records. The executives at Deca wanted Bill to experiment with a more modern sound. He agreed to try the electric guitar on a few tracks, but soon returned to his acoustic roots and dropped the electric guitar. During his time at Deca, he met Jimmy Martin, who would go on to join the band as a supporting vocalist. Throughout the 1950s and the rest of his career, Monroe performed tirelessly with hundreds of shows per year. In 1951, he established a country music park at Bean Blossom, Indiana. Hoosiers and others have been gathering at Bean Blossom to perform and jam since 1939. After Bill played at the Brown County Jamboree in 1951, he had the opportunity to purchase the land and establish a home base for bluegrass music. Over the years, the venue has hosted thousands of fans and performers at its annual Bill Monroe Bluegrass Festival, a multi-day event that Bill originated in 1967. In January 1953, Monroe was involved in a very bad car accident that temporarily halted his career. While driving home from a fox hunt north of Nashville, a drunk driver struck his vehicle head-on. Bill's injuries were severe. He sustained 19 broken bones, including his spine, and had one of his eyes dislodged from its socket. Despite his injuries, Bill managed to exit the car and rescue his fellow Bluegrass Boys band member, Bessie Lee Mauldin, from the other side of the vehicle. It took him almost 4 months in a full body cast to recover and return to touring. In the meantime, Charlie Klein and Jimmy Martin kept the band going. Bill had a special relationship with his bass player, Bessie Mauldin. She not only played the bass fiddle in the Bluegrass Boys for 12 years, but she and Bill may have been lovers. Bill might have first met Bessie in 1936 when she was in high school. Bessie won the contest for selling the most tickets to a Monroe Brothers concert at her high school in North Carolina. During this time, the Monroe Brothers had a regular radio show in Charlotte, near Bessie's hometown of Norwood, North Carolina. She became the bassist for the Bluegrass Boys in 1953, establishing a foothold for women musicians in what was a mostly male-dominated field. Bessie and Bill only wrote a few songs together, but their most famous was a gospel song, A Voice from on High, which was later covered by many artists, including the Stanley Brothers, Ricky Skaggs, and Bob Dylan. Bessie passed away in 1983 from heart disease and diabetes. In 1958, Monroe released his first album, Knee Deep in Bluegrass, and also had a hit single, Scotland, which reached number 27 on the country chart. However, his fame was overshadowed by Flatt Scruggs during the late 1950s. Monroe's notoriously difficult personality contributed to this, as many musicians left his band due to his demanding nature and perfectionism. He also rarely granted press interviews and seldom performed on television. He even canceled a concert at Carnegie Hall due to his belief that the promoter was a communist. His career was in need of a boost, and he got that when former Greenbrier boy Ralph Rinsler became his manager. He promoted Bill's shows at bluegrass festivals across the country. This was a period when bluegrass and folk music were making large inroads on college campuses, and Bill was riding the wave. Over Labor Day weekend in 1965, Carlton Haney promoted the first multi-day bluegrass festival at Cantrell's Horse Farm in Fincastle, Virginia. Haney built the Sunday finale show around the history of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Many of the original members of the band were on stage and performed with Bill. Fred Bartenstein, a longtime collaborator with Carlton Haney, who was only 14 at the time, clearly remembers the Bill Monroe story, as Carlton called it.
Most of the original musicians who played with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys were still alive, and a large number of them were there that Sunday afternoon. Carlton brought them out in order, starting with Clyde Moody playing the guitar. He had been on Bill Monroe's very first Bluebird sides with the Bluegrass Boys in 1940. So that was amazing to have Clyde Moody and Bill Monroe singing together on stage. And then after that, he was able to bring on Jim Eanes, Mac Wiseman, Don Reno, Benny Martin, Jimmy Martin, Larry Richardson, musicians that had down through the years both performed and recorded with Bill Monroe. It was Carlton Haney's narration, though, that made that experience hang together. It gave it a story, literally. It also charged Bill Monroe up tremendously, this notion that he would be the fellow that could work all day and stay on stage and take on any musician that came. It was like, what do they call those tough man contests? And Bill Monroe was the classic tough man on stage. And as I listened to the tape of that afternoon, he was putting songs in the highest keys he could think of, trying to make the musicians sing at the top of their range. And he took a lot of pleasure in singing tenor to all of them.
For more about the 1965 Fincastle Bluegrass Festival, please watch our documentary on this channel. After the success of the Fincastle Festival, Bill started his own annual multi-day festival at his country music park in Bean Blossom, Indiana. Bill was an active participant into the 1990s. In 1970, Monroe was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, and the following year, the Nashville Songwriters Association International Hall of Fame. And of course, in 1991, he was inducted into the inaugural class of the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. Bill was born with a genetic defect called esotropia, an eye misalignment in which one eye deviates inward towards the nose. The old-time term for this was hug eye, and the young Bill was very self-conscious about his condition. He was bullied, and as a shy youngster, he would hide when strangers came to visit for fear they might make fun of him. To help him detect approaching wagons, he developed an increased auditory acuity, which served him well as he ventured into the world of music. Just as Bill had used his music and acute hearing to get him through the tough times in his childhood, the music would serve to help him survive health issues in his old age. Even as he battled colon cancer in 1981, Monroe produced and released the album My Last Days on Earth, a testament to his indomitable spirit. Despite his illness, he continued to perform and tour for another 15 years. Through sheer will, he emerged victorious over cancer, but in 1991, he underwent a double heart bypass. Despite these challenges, he persisted in his passion for music and performance. Monroe's final performance was on March 15, 1996. As his health began to decline, he was no longer able to play his beloved mandolin or guitar. Sadly, on September 9, 1996, just 4 days before his 85th birthday, Monroe passed away in Springfield, Tennessee, following a stroke. Bill Monroe was a true giant in the world of music. His pioneering contributions to bluegrass not only established him as a master musician and innovator, but also helped to launch the careers of many of the most prominent artists in bluegrass and country music. His unique style and musical talent have been a major influence on countless performers in various genres, including Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, Carl Perkins, and Buddy Holly, among others. Additionally, his founding of the Bluegrass Park in Indiana created a vital venue and movement that has helped to preserve and promote the bluegrass sound for generations to come. His legacy will continue to be celebrated and revered by music lovers everywhere.
Go and catch your tin rugs and hitch him in the shade. We're going to bury Molly, a coffin ready made, oh Lord, coffin ready made.